In the heart of the Sahara, where the sand alone can hit 160 degrees Fahrenheit, dozens of containers are cracked open one by one. Not weapons, not water, millions of bees, frozen nearly solid for weeks, released straight into the most hostile desert on Earth. No shelter, no flowers, no water source in sight, and then they were left alone. For an entire year, it sounds like a fever dream, sending bees into one of the most hostile environments on Earth, on purpose, with serious scientific backing. But in 2023, environmental research teams across North Africa started asking a question nobody had seriously tried to answer. Could bees be the last line of defense for the Sahara's dying oases? Not greening the whole desert, just keeping what's left alive. Here's the problem. Bees start dying when hive temperatures cross around 40 degrees Celsius. Saharan summers regularly hit close to 50 inches the shade. So why did they send them in anyway? When the first bees were released near the Saharan oases, the researchers expected heat to be the main problem. It wasn't. The bigger problem was silence. No flowers, no steady pollen sources, no food network to plug into. A healthy colony can need millions of flower visits a year just to keep functioning normally. But in large parts of the Sahara, after a few weeks of hot wind, the thin layer of vegetation clinging to the edges of an oasis can nearly disappear entirely. And when that happens, a loop starts, one that's very hard to break. Fewer plants mean fewer bees. Fewer bees mean less pollination. Less pollination means fewer seeds. Fewer seeds mean fewer plants next season. Scientists call this a pollination collapse spiral. And the terrifying part is it doesn't announce itself. There's no explosion, no single moment where everything goes wrong. A field still looks green. An oasis still has water. But underneath, the numbers insects, seeds, pollen start quietly dropping every year until one season, there's just not enough left to recover. This isn't only a Sahara problem. About 75% of the world's food crops depend at least partly on pollinators. California alone needs more than 2 million bee colonies every year just to keep its almond industry running. Not thriving, running. And during the winter of 2024 to 2025, beekeepers across the U.S. reported losing around 60% of their colonies in a single season. 60%. In one winter. In parts of Western China, the situation already crossed a line most people don't know about. Wild bee populations there have declined so sharply that farmers in some regions now pollinate pear and apple trees by hand, using small brushes, climbing through branches, doing the job that insects used to do for free. Think about that for a second. Humans with paintbrushes, replacing bees. That's not a future warning. That's already happening. And this is exactly why the Sahara experiment started to matter beyond what anyone originally planned. Because what the researchers were watching wasn't just whether bees could survive extreme heat. They were watching what happens to an ecosystem when its pollination layer starts to collapse in real time, in the harshest conditions on the planet. The Sahara is, in a strange way, the perfect stress test. If ecosystem collapse has a worst-case version, it probably looks something like this. No buffer, no backup, no margin for error, which makes what happened next genuinely surprising. Because some of those colonies didn't collapse, some of them held on, not the ones you'd expect, not the strongest, not the largest. And the reason why changes the way you think about survival entirely. The colonies that survived longest in the Sahara didn't behave like normal bees. At first, most researchers assumed the biggest challenge would be temperature. Build heat-resistant hives, find heat-resistant bees, problem solved. But after several months of observation, something unexpected showed up in the data. The bees that were still alive hadn't changed their bodies. They had changed their schedule. In the surviving colonies, peak activity happened before sunrise. Flight almost completely stopped during midday. Then they came back out in the late afternoon and into the early evening, sometimes even after dark. In other words, they stopped fighting the sun. They started working around it. If that sounds familiar, it's because nearly every animal that survives in the desert does exactly the same thing. Fennec foxes hunt at night. Scorpions stay buried under sand during daylight. Desert gazelles cut their movement down to almost nothing when the sun is highest. They don't try to beat the heat. They avoid the hours it exists. Nobody expected bees to do this. Bees are daytime insects. That's basically part of their identity. And yet, Thermal cameras set up near oasis zones in Algeria showed sand surface temperatures exceeding 65 to 70 degrees Celsius during the day. But just a few hours after sunset, that same ground dropped by more than 25 degrees. That window, that 2 or 3 hour stretch between when the sand cools and when the desert night gets too dark, is when life moves. That's the survival window. And it turns out, the plants already knew this. Some desert flowers in the region were opening later than normal, holding their pollen longer, releasing stronger scents after dark, essentially advertising to pollinators that the shop was open at night. The bees and the flowers had independently shifted to the same schedule, without any coordination, without any intervention, just two organisms solving the same problem the same way. This is when the experiment started asking a different question. A recent review of arid ecosystem data found that nocturnal pollinators play a significant role in nearly 90% of dry ecosystems studied. 90%. And most of that activity happens while humans are completely asleep. We've been studying desert ecosystems for decades, setting up cameras, collecting samples, publishing papers, and we've been doing most of it during daylight hours, which means we may have been systematically missing half the story. The Sahara was never a dead ecosystem. It's an ecosystem running on a schedule we weren't watching. And that realization quietly changed everything about the experiment. It stopped being a story about whether bees could survive somewhere extreme. It became something much more uncomfortable. How long have we been wrong about how the desert actually works? Here's the part that no one expected. The colonies that lasted the longest weren't the biggest. They weren't the most productive. They weren't the most aggressive defenders of their hive. They were smaller, more scattered, quieter, lower output, less honey, less of everything we'd normally use to measure a colony's success. On paper, they look like the weak ones, but in the Sahara, being optimized turned out to be a liability. Think about what a large colony actually needs. More water, more flowers, more energy just to keep the hive cool enough to function. When heat stress drags on for weeks, those demands don't drop, they compound. And the colonies with the biggest appetites started collapsing first. The small ones, running on what you could call minimum survival mode, doing less, consuming less, asking almost nothing from an environment that had almost nothing to give. Those were the ones still standing months later. This is exactly how desert ecosystems have operated for thousands of years. Low consumption, no excess, every calorie spent only when necessary. The desert doesn't reward ambition, it rewards restraint. And this is where the experiment starts to feel a little uncomfortable. Because we do the opposite of restraint, constantly. For decades, humans have selectively bred commercial bees for maximum output. Gentler temperament, higher honey yield, easier to manage at scale. We built the ideal agricultural bee compliant, productive, efficient. And in doing so, we may have quietly stripped away the one thing that actually keeps a colony alive when conditions turn brutal. Varroa mite is a good example of what that looks like in practice. It's a parasite that attaches to bees, weakens them, and spreads viruses through an entire colony. It's been devastating commercial operations around the world for years, contributing directly to colony collapse events across North America, Europe, and parts of Asia. Most commercial colonies today cannot survive a Varroa infestation without human intervention, without treatments, without management. Take the beekeeper out of the equation, and many of those hives don't make it through the season. Meanwhile, certain wild African bee populations, less domesticated, less optimized, considerably more difficult to work with, have shown meaningful resistance to the same parasite. Not immunity, but resilience, the kind that doesn't require an intervention schedule. The Sahara experiment didn't set out to make this point, but it made it anyway. The thing that survives longest isn't necessarily the thing built to perform best under ideal conditions. It's the thing that still knows how to function when conditions stop being ideal. And that gap between optimized and adaptable is getting wider. Not just in bees. There's a version of this story that's easy to apply to almost anything. Supply chains built for maximum efficiency that snap under a single disruption. Cities designed for growth that can't handle a drought. Systems so streamlined they've lost the slack that would let them flex. The Sahara wasn't teaching researchers about bees. It was holding up a mirror. The most important survivors weren't the strongest. They were the ones that hadn't forgotten how to be small. After nearly a year, the Sahara did not turn green. No carpet of wildflowers across the dunes. No rivers cutting through the sand. No before and after photo that goes viral. And honestly, That was always the realistic outcome. Bees don't create water. They don't manufacture soil. They don't conjure rainfall out of dry air. What they do, what they've always done, is stabilize whatever life is already trying to exist. They make fragile things slightly less fragile. That's the whole job. So what did a year of monitoring actually show? At several oasis sites, fruit-bearing rates among native trees went up. Some species of wild desert flowers extended their seasonal window, blooming for longer than they typically would. Small insect populations around water sources ticked upward. Nothing dramatic. Nothing that would make headlines on its own. But enough to confirm something important. Even in one of the most resource-depleted ecosystems on the planet, a functioning pollinator chain can still produce a ripple effect. The chain still works. It just needs something to start it. That's actually a meaningful result. It just doesn't look like a miracle, so it's easy to dismiss. And here's where it gets complicated. Because the moment humans see any sign of success, any green shoots, any uptick in data, the instinct kicks in to scale it up. More bees, more trees, bigger projects, faster timelines. Turn this small proof of concept into a continental restoration effort. It sounds like the right move. It has been the wrong move, repeatedly for decades. Across North Africa and the Middle East, there's a long history of desert greening projects that started with genuine good intentions and ended badly. Some large-scale tree planting initiatives in arid zones drew so heavily on underground water reserves that they accelerated the very desertification they were trying to reverse. Others introduced non-native plant species that altered soil salinity, making the land harder for anything to grow, including the native plants that had been quietly surviving there for centuries. The land didn't need rescuing. It needed to be left alone to do what it already knew how to do. Sahara doesn't need to become a forest to matter. A functioning oasis that keeps its trees for another 50 years matters. A pollinator chain that prevents one more plant species from disappearing matters. Small, stable, resilient. That's a win, even if it doesn't photograph well. Maybe the most important result from this entire year of observation wasn't about bees at all. It was the reminder that ecosystems don't need humans to fix them. They need humans to stop assuming that fixing them means making them look like something else. The desert was never broken. It was just being the desert. And that distinction between broken and different turns out to be everything. We went into the Sahara looking for a way to fix it. That was the assumption underneath the whole thing. That the desert was broken. That it was empty in a way that needed correcting. Too hot, too dry, too lifeless to serve any real purpose unless we could make it look like something else. But the bee experiment didn't fix the Sahara. What it did was far stranger. It made us realize we had been misreading it the whole time. The Sahara is not a dead zone waiting to be rescued. It is an ecosystem operating at an extreme that most life cannot tolerate. And that is not the same thing as being useless. Here's a fact that most people have never heard. Every year, hundreds of millions of tons of dust lift off the surface of North Africa and travel west across the Atlantic Ocean. Some of it settles in the Caribbean. Some of it keeps going. Tens of millions of tons eventually fall over the Amazon rainforest, carrying phosphorus, one of the most critical nutrients that tropical trees need to grow. Let that land for a second. Part of the Amazon, one of the most biologically dense places on the planet, is being fertilized by the Sahara. By a place we look at and see nothing. By a place we fly over and think, wasteland. The desert that looks most dead is quietly feeding the forest that looks most alive. And once you see that connection, you start seeing the same pattern everywhere in the story. Small bees holding the food chain together. Night insects carrying out pollination while everyone sleeps. A single oasis anchoring an entire micro-ecosystem across hundreds of square kilometers. And desert dust crossing an ocean to nourish a rainforest. None of these things are dramatic. None of them make headlines. You can't photograph them in a way that goes viral. But remove any one of them, and something downstream collapses. That's what the experiment quietly proved. Not that bees can save the Sahara, not that science can reverse desertification, but that the places we write off as worthless are often doing something invisible and irreplaceable, and we only notice when it stops. We have a habit of measuring the value of a place by how much it looks like somewhere we already approve of. Green, lush, productive by human standards. The Sahara fails every one of those tests. And yet, maybe the most honest thing this experiment gave us wasn't data. It was a different question to ask when we look at a place that seems empty. Not, how do we fix this? But what is this already doing that we haven't noticed yet? Nature has rarely been as fragile as we've assumed. It's just that a lot of what it does happens at night, underground, or across distances too large for us to easily track. The bees didn't transform the desert, but spending a year watching them try changed something in how we see it. And that might be the more important result.